Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MrDarxnight. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep. So before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. They went to sleep in cabin 12 and were never seen again. No screams, no footprints, just an empty room and a black handprint on the ceiling. Tucked deep within the endless pines of northern Maine, far from highways, cities, and even the scattered cabins of weekend wanderers, lies a forgotten land once known as Black Hollow Retreat. The entrance road, now overgrown with creeping ivy and fractured by roots, used to wind lazily through 10 miles of dense forest before spilling into a sun-dappled clearing, the kind that seemed untouched by time. In that clearing, bordered by towering oaks and the constant hush of wind against leaves, a dozen small wooden cabins stood in a gentle semicircle around a mirror-still lake. The lake, wide and glassy, was a crown jewel of the camp. It reflected the trees with stillness that almost felt unnatural. Never a ripple unless stirred by dragonflies or the lightest breeze. At night, under full moonlight, the surface resembled black velvet, swallowing light and echo alike. Birds called in the daytime. At dusk, the world settled into a stillness, so complete it could almost be mistaken for peace. But locals said the land had always been too quiet. The trees didn't rustle like they did elsewhere. Sound died faster. Echoes didn't last. The cabins were all uniform, log-built, with stone chimneys and screened windows, old-fashioned lanterns by the door, and a single number carved into each wooden threshold. Cabin 12, placed slightly apart from the others under the shadow of a tall hemlock, always seemed colder. Some days, even in the middle of a summer heat wave, condensation formed along its porch railings as if it had just rained. Its steps creaked differently, hollow, almost warped. Campers noticed it. Counselors dismissed it. But no one stayed in cabin 12 unless assigned. Black Hollow had opened in the early 1960s, intended as a rustic, back-to-nature experience for teenagers from New England's wealthier suburbs. No electricity in the cabins. No radios, no TV. Just fishing, hiking, campfires, and the kind of handwritten letters home that now live only in old shoeboxes and attics. Over the decades, thousands of campers passed the retreat, most returning with stories of friendship, crushes, and ghost tales told under the stars. It was a place of first kisses, scraped knees, and nights filled with the chirping of crickets. Parents trusted it. The staff were carefully vetted. The surrounding land was protected by the state. Despite its charm, Black Hollow was never popular enough to attract attention. It ran quietly, year after year, operated by the same small family. By the 1990s, it had become a sort of well-kept secret among those who still believed in the magic of unplugged summers. Brochures showed children smiling with muddy faces, roasting marshmallows, canoeing beneath the morning mist. It all felt simple, safe, and pure. But the land told a different story to those who listened. Old-growth trees whispered in the windless air. Animals often avoided the lakeshore entirely. Birds circled above, but rarely nested nearby. Some counselors, those who stayed multiple seasons, began to notice the patterns. Certain parts of the woods fell heavier. Some paths led nowhere, and then changed direction when walked again. Cabin 12's door would sometimes be found open in the morning, though no one ever admitted forgetting to lock it, at least once a summer. Someone claimed to have sleepwalked into the woods behind that cabin with no memory of how they got there. No major incidents ever made the news. Nothing official ever got filed. Just stories, passed quietly between returning counselors, noted with nervous laughs but never taken seriously. Staff turnover remained high. A few simply left mid-season without explanation. Their names were removed from rosters, their cabins reassigned. Nothing more was said. The forest around the retreat was known by the local Penobscot tribes long before the camp was ever built. Oral tradition spoke of a silent stretch of land where no lodges were made, no fires built, and no footsteps left behind. It was said the earth did not belong to men, that something else lived beneath the roots, deep and old, and that silence was not a blessing but a warning. Early settlers disregarded such stories, and when the retreat was founded, Few even remember the tales. Over time, the name Black Hollow became more than just a poetic reference to the shadowy woods. It became part of the camp's identity. But in certain light, or from a particular angle, the lake itself seemed to swallow light, as if it truly was a hollow, a void carved into land, filled not with water, but memory. Today, the camp is no more. The signs have fallen. The cabins decay in the hush of the forest, vines curling through broken windows, raccoons nesting in what were once bunk beds. But even now, hikers who stumble too close say the air grows cold near the old lake. Their phones lose signal. A strange smell clings to the underbrush, something musty, burnt, and sour. And every now and then, someone claims to have found cabin 12 still standing, perfectly preserved, door ajar, as if it's still waiting for the next campers to arrive. But not everyone who finds it comes back. For nearly 3 decades, Black Hollow Retreat maintained an impeccable reputation among parents and schools across New England. While larger camps chased modernity, installing cabins with Wi-Fi, climbing walls, and artificial lakes, Black Hollow stayed faithful to simplicity. It advertised no thrills, no gimmicks, just quiet, just nature, just time away, and that, more than anything, appealed to a certain type of family, the ones who saw stillness as something sacred. The brochures never changed much. A hand-drawn map of the retreat, a few photographs of children catching frogs or reading beneath trees, and a letter from the founder promising a safe haven for youthful minds to reconnect with Earth's self and silence. Enrollment was selective, and the waiting list, especially by the late 1980s, stretched into the following summer. Most campers came by word of mouth. Parents sent children not for sports or structure, but for something gentler. A pause, an escape, in the quiet corners of Connecticut and Massachusetts, where private schools and close-knit families shaped childhoods, Black Hollow became a trusted name. Grandparents who had once visited as teens now signed up their grandchildren. Generations of families made the same drive down the pine-lined roads, through winding hills and sleepy towns, until the landscape itself seemed to forget what century it belonged to. Children who had never before spent a night without electronics or background noise soon learned the rhythm of forest life. Mornings began with bird song and dew-soaked grass. Breakfasts were eaten on benches facing the lake. Days were divided into walks, crafts, quiet time, and stories. No buzzers, no shouting. Even the meal times were calm. Campers were encouraged to whisper after dusk and to write in journals before bed. A culture of quietness was not enforced, but gently expected. The world outside felt far away, and for many, that was the point. There were rules, of course, but they were soft-edged. Curfews, fire safety, canoe limits. The camp staff prided themselves on watching without hovering. Counselors often came from local colleges, trained not just in safety but in how to hold space, how to help children feel heard without pressure. It wasn't unusual for a child who struggled in school or home to return from Black Hollow changed, calmer, more confident, more still inside. There were no reported accidents in the camp's first 20 years. No fires, no wildlife incidents, no drownings. The lake remained safe, shallow at its edges, with lifeguards posted during every swim. Cabin inspections were routine, supplies well-stocked. The health officer kept detailed records of even minor injuries. Band-aids were handed out more often than actual first aid was needed. The nearest hospital had never once received an emergency call from the camp. In state records, Black Hollow was quietly exceptional, fully licensed, thoroughly inspected, and never cited. Parents who visited for end-of-season pickups often described the place as almost surreal in its peace. The silence, they'd say, was so thick you could feel it. Many remarked on how deeply their children slept during their time there. One father once joked that his son hadn't slept through the night in 10 years until he came back from Black Hollow. Another mother wrote in a thank you letter that her daughter stopped grinding her teeth for the first time since kindergarten. Camp directors framed these stories on the office wall, testaments to the healing stillness of the woods. But over time, those same stories began to collect a different tone. Parents would note how tired their children seemed, even after sleeping 10 hours a night. Some said their kids were unusually quiet for days after returning home. One boy had stopped speaking for nearly a week, just drew trees over and over in his notebook without explanation. His parents attributed it to post-camp adjustment. He was eventually fine. Stranger still with recurring dreams. At least 4 separate families, all in different years, described their children waking in the night speaking of Blackwater, of cabins that whispered, or of something moving the trees that couldn't be seen in the day. These stories, shared during pickup conversations or through letters to camp, were gently dismissed, a result of imagination, overstimulation, or just a natural eeriness of unfamiliar darkness. Camp counselors, too, occasionally noted odd behaviors. Campers who sleepwalked despite no history of doing so, sudden fevers that disappear by morning, and bouts of somnambulant talking in unfamiliar voices. These incidents were written up quietly, stored in folders, mentioned only if a pattern emerged. But no pattern ever quite formed, and so they were filed away. Despite these anomalies, the camp's record remained untarnished. There was no scandal, no headline, no lawsuit. In the public eye, Black Hollow remained an ideal, a sanctuary. It had earned its place among the best-kept secrets of the Northeast, a place where children were safe, even transformed, where summer meant solitude, softness, and connection. But beneath that calm surface, some things never quite settled. Some things were never quite seen. And some cabins, though clean and quiet, never truly felt empty. Among those, Cabin 12 stood alone, literally and figuratively, just far enough from the others to feel isolated, just close enough to be ignored. No more dangerous, no less inviting, just different. And in the summer of 1993, that difference would finally be noticed. The summer of 1993 began like all the others at Black Hollow Retreat. Slow, warm, and deceptively ordinary. The sun rose early, filtered through the misty canopy of pines, and warmed the quiet clearing by the lake. By late June, the cabins were freshly cleaned, bunks were made with crisp sheets, and the staff, mostly returning college students, arrived for orientation. Final checks were done on first aid kits, life jackets, lantern oil, and food supplies. Cabin assignments were finalized, and the same faded welcome sign was hung at the entrance. Return to silence. That year, the second week of July was reserved for the oldest age group, 14 to 16-year-olds. Teen Week was always the most unpredictable, old enough to test limits, too young to fully understand them. But at Black Hollow, even the teens seemed quieter. Perhaps it was a lack of distraction, or the way the woods seemed to press in gently from all sides. The stillness of the place had a way of dimming rebellion. 20 campers arrived that week, coming in small groups, mostly from Massachusetts and southern Maine. They were dropped off by parents, most of whom stayed just long enough for a hug and a photograph by the lakeside. Some teens already knew each other from past summers, exchanging lazy high-fives and inside jokes. Others were new, nervous, awkward, drawn into themselves in the way teenagers often are when forced into unfamiliar company. But the camp was designed for that. Its schedule gave them space. Bonds would form slowly, without pressure. Campers were divided into 5 cabins per group, with boys and girls housed on opposite sides of the clearing. Cabin 12, as usual, was one of the boys' cabins. It was rarely chosen first. There was something subtly uncomfortable about it. Its slight tilt, the constant shade from the tall hemlocks behind it, the way its front step creaked sharply when touched. But it was still a functioning cabin. There was no official reason to avoid it. That year, 4 boys were assigned to it, 2 returning campers and 2 first-timers. All had been vetted, their medical forms filled, their personalities described as quiet, creative, or sensitive by their parents. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The first few days passed uneventfully. Morning nature walks, silent breakfast, group canoeing, and writing sessions near the fire pit. A quiet rhythm began to settle over the camp, one that many returning staff had come to rely on. Unlike other camps, there was no need to constantly redirect attention or enforce rules. The teens followed the structure with an almost eerie ease. In journals and mealtime conversations, they spoke of strange dreams, but nothing more than idle curiosities, visions of animals that didn't exist, unfamiliar landscapes, distorted voices calling from far off. Cabin 12's boys blended into the background. They weren't troublemakers. They followed instructions. They joked quietly with one another, kept their space clean, and participated in every scheduled activity. They spent evenings on the cabin porch, sometimes tossing pebbles at a metal bucket, sometimes just sitting in silence. The staff marked them as low maintenance. No signs of friction, no fights, no homesickness. In many ways, they were ideal campers. But beneath the ordinary, subtle shifts began to form. On the third night, one of the counselors noticed the boys in cabin 12 went to bed earlier than the rest. Lights out was officially at 9:30, but they had already gone quiet by 9:10. The next night, it was the same. By the fourth night, one boy didn't come to breakfast, claiming to feel cold and dizzy. A basic checkup found nothing wrong. He returned to normal by lunch. That same week, another boy in the cabin was heard muttering in his sleep. The counselor who passed by on night round said the boy's voice was unusually low, almost garbled, as if underwater. It lasted only a few seconds and didn't repeat. Noted and dismissed. Sleep talking wasn't uncommon among teens, especially in unfamiliar beds. One journal entry recovered later would mention a dream, a black hallway with no end, lit only by a soft humming. It didn't seem important at the time. Just one of many surreal entries found in the boys' free-writing exercises. Dreams and metaphors were common at Black Hollow. They were even encouraged. That week's weather had also turned. By the fifth day, skies darkened early. Thunderstorms rolled in from the west, coating the forest in mist and turning the paths between cabins into muddy veins. The lake, usually serene and sparkling, became gray and motionless. Instructors kept the campers indoors longer. Board games and indoor crafts took the place of canoeing. The silence of the forest, already deep, thickened. The night before the vanishing was uneventful, at least on the surface. Campers roasted marshmallows near the central fire, told stories. Some funny, some meant to spook, and returned to their cabins by curfew. Cabin 12's porch light was seen flickering once before going out. No one thought much of it. By morning, everything would change. Cabin 12 had always held a quiet reputation, passed between counselors in sideways glances and unfinished sentences. It was never officially labeled as problematic. No reports ever detailed structural issues. No parents ever filed complaints. Yet among those who returned summer after summer, it had a name that meant something. Spoken without explanation, always with subtle drop in tone. The Weird One. Physically, it was identical to the other boys' cabins. 4 bunk beds, a wooden trunk for each camper, a lantern hung from a hook in the center beam, a small window on each wall, a single, thick door that creaked but latched securely. Yet somehow, despite its sameness, Cabin 12 felt different, often in a way that defied documentation. Some claimed it leaned ever so slightly toward the woods, though no level ever proved it. Others said it always smelled faintly of damp ash, even when freshly cleaned. A few swore the cabin was colder, no matter the weather. Its location was the first subtle cue. Unlike the other cabins, which faced a lake or stood in easy sight of the main path, Cabin 12 was set just a few feet further back, near the tree where the sun took longer to reach and the shadows fell earlier. The tall hemlocks behind it loomed closer, their branches so tightly woven they blocked out the moonlight entirely. At night, the path to its porch felt darker than any other. Only a few extra steps, yet enough to make some staff walk faster. The small things piled up over the years. Flashlights that flickered inside only that cabin, despite fresh batteries. Compass needles that jittered briefly when placed on the wooden floor. A porch step that groaned louder than expected, even when no weight pressed it. None of these were alarming on their own, but together, they built something quiet and persistent. A mood, a feeling, a presence that refused to be named outright. First-year counselors were often placed in Cabin 12 without warning, the staff unwilling to explain its reputation directly. Some laughed it off, only to report restless sleep or strange noises after lights out. One counselor in the early 80s requested a reassignment midweek, citing discomfort without further detail. Another simply failed to return the following summer, despite previously enthusiastic reviews. When asked, their reasons were vague, something about not sleeping well, or an uneasy feeling they couldn't shake. It was never enough to raise concern, but always enough to be remembered. Returning campers, especially those who had stayed in Cabin 12, rarely requested it again. Some pretended to have no memory of their week there, which wasn't unusual on the surface. Teenagers forget things, especially uneventful weeks. But those who did speak about often used the same phrases. Heavy air, strange quiet, weird dreams. None of them ever mentioned anything overtly threatening, just unsettling. One boy once wrote in a post-camp letter that it felt like the trees were watching through the windows. Among the staff, private stories emerged and evolved over time. A flashlight left on the cabin floor, found melted the next morning. A bunk that shifted position slightly overnight. A cabin door that wouldn't stay latched until a scrap of birch bark was wedged into the threshold. None of these occurrences were ever reported officially. They lived in staff memory, shared around late-night bonfires, with the unspoken understanding that Cabin 12 was simply strange, but harmless. Probably, the camp director maintained that all cabins were inspected, weatherproofed, and structurally sound. In one preseason walkthrough, the director noted that Cabin 12 had more moss on its roof than any of the others, despite receiving the same maintenance. It was cleaned again. Still, the moss returned. Another counselor, during the 1990 season, found a small circle of pebbles arranged in the center of the cabin floor on the third day of camp. Each pebble was smooth and dark, and none matched the gravel paths used around the retreat. The boys claimed they hadn't noticed it. The stones were swept up and discarded. The incident wasn't written up. Later that same summer, a camper said he dreamed that he was under the cabin, not in it, trapped in dirt, hearing footsteps above. The story was told casually, mentioned in a journal prompt, and never followed up. But those kinds of dreams seemed to surface more often from Cabin 12's occupants. Still, the retreat continued. Assignments were made. Forms were filed. Campers were rotated in and out, most with no memories of anything unusual. If Cabin 12 carried a strange energy, it did so subtly, never enough to disrupt the schedule, never enough to warn alarm. It remained, year after year, simply another wooden structure among many, until July 1993. That summer, Cabin 12 was filled again. 4 boys, 2 returning, 2 new. No red flags. No strange behaviors during intake. The counselors saw nothing alarming, but the whispers had returned, literal and metaphorical. The old unease crept back into the margins of the staff's minds, unspoken but undeniably present. And then one night, the silence around Cabin 12 deepened in a way it never had before. By morning, everything was gone. July 17th, 1993 began like the others that week. Overcast, cool, with a dampness in the air that clung to everything. The storm from the night before had passed, but the sky remained low and gray. The ground between cabins was slick, and the trail to the lake was peppered with soggy leaves and broken twigs. Camp activities were modified to keep campers closer to the center of the grounds. Canoeing was canceled. Hiking was postponed. The campfire pit remained too wet to light. Inside the lodge, staff kept spirits up with board games and storytelling. Campers gathered around tables with coloring sheets and hot chocolate. The mood remained relaxed. The energy was lower than usual, but nothing seemed abnormal. Some campers mentioned headaches. A few others described a heavy feeling behind their eyes, as if they hadn't slept well. Counselors attributed it to cabin air, humidity, or just typical teenage sluggishness. The boys in Cabin 12 were quiet, as usual. They participated when asked. They stayed together as a group during meals and free time. No one seemed withdrawn or distressed. One boy asked for an extra blanket after lunch, saying his hands felt cold. Another was seen standing for several minutes by the edge of the woods behind his cabin, unmoving. When asked, he said he was just watching the wind. Staff took note, but didn't press. Teenagers often sought solitude, and at Black Hollow, such moments were common and respected. Later that day, the clouds grew darker. A steady drizzle began to fall just before dinner. The lake turned slate gray, its surface flat and expressionless. A single canoe, pulled up on shore, rocked slightly in the wind, creaking as it shifted against the dock. A faint smell of ozone lingered in the air, as if the storm hadn't fully left. The rain, though soft, persisted. That night, instead of gathering around the fire pit as planned, the campers remained in the lodge for an indoor storytelling session. Counselors dimmed the lights, lit candles, and took turns reading aloud from old camp journals and ghost tales, an annual tradition meant to entertain, not frighten. Most of the stories were humorous or gently spooky. Giggles filled the room, punctuated by the occasional gasp or mock scream. It was the kind of laughter designed to keep the darkness away. A few stories mentioned Cabin 12, though only in passing. A line about its creaky porch. A joke about how it was always colder than the rest. The boys assigned to the cabin smiled but said nothing. They seemed comfortable, detached even, observing more than participating. By 9 p.m., the lodge was cleaned up and the campers dismissed. Rain still fell softly outside, pattering against the leaves and rooftops. Flashlights bobbed between cabins. Mud stuck to boots. The camp was quiet, wrapped in wet shadows. Inside their cabins, most campers prepared for bed. The usual sounds of zippers, whispered conversations, and bunk beds shifting filled the night. In Cabin 12, the lantern was turned off at 9:12 p.m. A counselor walking past noted it, checked his watch, and continued the night round. No voices were heard. No lights flicked back on. The cabin appeared still, silent and ordinary. Somewhere around 3 a.m., a camper in the neighboring cabin would later report waking up briefly. He didn't remember why. No noise, no nightmare. Just a feeling. He rolled over, looked at the window, and saw a faint light glowing behind the trees. Not a flashlight, not lightning. A soft white-blue hue. It faded after a few seconds. He fell back asleep. Another camper, in a different cabin across the clearing, told his counselor the next morning that he had a strange dream. In it, he heard humming, low and constant, coming from somewhere beneath the camp. He couldn't describe the tune, just the vibration. He woke up with a nosebleed. His pillow was lightly stained. His counselor wrote it down, but assumed it was a random occurrence. Dry air, elevation, back at Cabin 12, all appeared normal. The door was shut. The windows were unbroken. No lights were seen. No noise came from within. No one called for help. No one screamed. The rain stopped just after 4 a.m. By then, the forest had returned to perfect stillness. When morning came, a soft fog blanketed the camp. It curled low around the cabins, muffling sound and muting color. Birds stayed silent. The lake was still. Breakfast was served at 7 a.m. Campers arrived slowly, rubbing their eyes, adjusting their clothes. Counselors moved between tables, checking attendance. The 4 boys from Cabin 12 never showed. At first, no one panicked. Teens overslept. Beds were warm. Mornings were hard. But after repeated knocks on the cabin door, received no answer, staff entered. What they found would never be fully explained. Sunday, July 18th, began in silence, so complete it felt unnatural, even by Black Hollow standards. The usual morning chorus of birdsong was absent. The lake, typically catching the first light of dawn in shimmering patterns, remained flat and dark beneath a low ceiling of fog. The air smelled faintly metallic, as if rain had fallen again overnight, though none had. The camp, always known for its quiet, felt smothered under a deeper kind of stillness, a stillness that made the counselors speak more softly, without meaning to, and the campers look at each other with brief, uncertain glances. The dining lodge filled slowly. Some campers arrived on their own, others in pairs or small groups, still half asleep. The normal morning chatter was subdued. Trays clinked, chairs scraped. A few staff members noted the low energy. Some suspected the humidity was to blame. Others whispered about the full moon that had hung above the trees the night before, barely visible through the mist. Many had slept fitfully, though none could say why. It was only when breakfast rolls were being served that someone noticed the missing names on the attendance clipboard. Cabin 12. For boys, not one present. At first, it was assumed they were late. Oversleeping wasn't unusual, especially during the slower, cooler days after storms. A junior counselor was sent to fetch them. When he returned 5 minutes later with a blank expression and empty hands, the senior staff stepped in. Two counselors approached the cabin with growing unease. The door was closed. The windows were shut. From the outside, the cabin looked untouched, perfectly ordinary. The lantern by the door still hung from its hook, unmoved by wind. When the door was opened, nothing looked obviously wrong at first glance. For beds, all made, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, everything in its place. But something felt off in the way the air sat in the room, thick and stale, almost unmoving. The kind of stillness found in sealed attics or abandoned basements. Not in a cabin that had housed 4 teenage boys just hours earlier. The beds were too neat, not just made, but undisturbed, flat, crisp, tucked, as if no one had slept in them at all. Even the pillows held no indentations. The sheets bore no wrinkles. On the floor, 4 pairs of shoes were neatly arranged beneath the bunks, socks folded beside them, trunks still closed, some partially latched. On one, a folded shirt with a name tag still attached. The sense of absence was overwhelming. Not chaos, not disorder, but a kind of surgical removal, precise, silent, clean. The lantern inside the cabin, normally filled with oil, had burned dry. Its glass was smudged with soot. The wick was blackened, curled in a strange pattern that resembled a spiral. On the small wooden table near the back wall, a single dead moth rested on its back, wings curled inward. A faint smell of something burnt, wood, but not from the fireplace, lingered in the corners. Then came the discovery that would never be explained. On the ceiling above the center of the room, there was a handprint, black, charred-looking, smudged at the edges. It had not been there during the cabin inspections earlier that week. Its size was ambiguous, larger than a child's, smaller than adults, but distorted as if the fingers that stretched through the print had been dragged upward. The surface of the ceiling beneath it was slightly discolored, not just from soot, but warped, as if heat had briefly touched it from within. The counselors exchanged uncertain looks. No one touched it. By midday, a full search had begun. Every counselor was briefed. Every camper accounted for. The lake was checked. The woods were combed. Docks, fire pits, trails, nothing. No footprints in the mud around cabin 12. No drag marks. No broken branches. No clothing caught on shrubs. Nothing disturbed. It was as though the boys had vanished without leaving the cabin, without opening the door, without moving a single object. By 3 p.m., the local authorities had been called. They arrived just after sunset. Flashlights cut through the fog. Voices echoed across the camp as officers conducted their own sweep. Dogs were brought in but behaved strangely, hesitant to approach the cabin, tails low, ears flat. They sniffed the beds, the doorway, the shoes, and then laid down, refusing to continue. No scents, no trails. Interviews with campers and staff produced no helpful leads. No one had heard anything. No voices in the night. No creaks of the porch. No cries for help. No slamming doors or breaking glass. The cabin door had been locked from the inside. The windows latched. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. No blood. No damage. No bodies. No witnesses. By midnight, the search had expanded into the woods beyond the property. Volunteers arrived with lanterns. Officials mapped the area, marking distances and paths. Still, no trace. Not a thread. Not a footprint. The forest swallowed everything. Rumors spread quickly, even before the press arrived. Campers whispered about dreams they'd had. Counselors avoided the path that passed too close to the cabin. A few staff members packed and left during the night, citing emergencies that were never explained. In the report filed the next morning, the incident was labeled as an unexplained disappearance. The camp was closed for the remainder of the season. The boys' names will remain on the lodge roster for the rest of the year. No new campers were ever assigned to Cabin 12 again. The official investigation into the disappearance of the 4 boys from Cabin 12 began slowly, in part because there was nothing to investigate. What little there was. An undisturbed room, a burned-out lantern, a handprint no one could explain, left more questions than answers. The lead investigator noted the absence of physical evidence in his initial report, describing the scene as sterile, as if no one had ever stayed there. No fingerprints were found on the inside of the door latch. No stray hairs, no fibers, no bodily fluids, not even residual sweat on the pillows. It was as though the cabin had been staged, then sealed. The beds, neatly made, suggested either no one had used them or that someone had taken the time to reset them perfectly. But that would have required time, precision, and motive, none of which made sense in the context of 4 teenage boys disappearing overnight without struggle. More unsettling than what was found was what was not found. Their clothing remained in the trunks. Their shoes were placed neatly beneath the bunks. Personal items, a watch, a sketch pad, a paperback novel, were untouched, almost carefully arranged. Forensic investigators tested the handprint on the ceiling. Preliminary analysis ruled out common substances: soot, paint, oil. The black residue could not be easily identified. It was slightly acidic, but not corrosive enough to damage the wooden surface. Samples were taken and sent to multiple labs, but no definitive origin was ever determined. The texture was described as dry ash mixed with something organic. Under ultraviolet light, the print exhibited no fluorescence. Under infrared, it absorbed completely, showing up as a black void against the wooden grain. The warped ceiling beneath the print was examined for heat damage. No electrical wiring ran through that portion of the cabin. There had been no fire, yet though it showed signs of subtle blistering, as if exposed to brief concentrated heat. The pattern of damage was too localized to be environmental. There were no nearby heat sources. The lantern's burn radius did not reach that height. No plausible explanation was found. Authorities expanded the search perimeter to 5 miles outside the campgrounds. Volunteers, law enforcement, and trained search and rescue teams combed the woods in coordinated grids. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras flew overhead. Cadaver dogs were rotated in and out, but none hit on a scent. Creeks were searched. Sinkholes probed. Wildlife traps and abandoned sheds were checked. Still nothing. Divers were sent into the lake, dragging sonar equipment across its still, muddy floor. The lake was shallow near the edge, deeper near the center. Visibility was poor, but the search continued for days. No signs of the boys emerged. No clothing. No remains. Not even a dropped item. The lake bed undisturbed. The silt layer showed no recent movement, as if no one had entered it in weeks. Investigators interviewed every camper and staff member. Most offered nothing helpful. Some recalled small oddities, sounds in the night, strange dreams, flickering lights, but no one had seen anything suspicious. A few campers admitted to feeling uneasy around Cabin 12, but couldn't explain why. One girl from a neighboring cabin said she dreamed the boys had been pulled through the floor, though she said it with the same tone children use when telling ghost stories. Her statement was not formally recorded. The staff members responsible for night rounds were cleared. The last person confirmed to see Cabin 12 undisturbed was a counselor at 9:12 p.m. After that, no one entered or exited. The door, when opened the next morning, was still latched from the inside. Rumors began to circulate. Some parents accused the staff of covering up foul play. Others whispered about occult connections, citing the black handprint and eerie silence. An anonymous tip alleged that the camp director had once performed a seance in the cabin during the late 1970s. No evidence supported the claim, but it was enough to generate local media interest. Headlines referred to the retreat as the Vanishing Camp. News trucks lined the dirt road for 2 days before being turned away by law enforcement. The camp was closed indefinitely. Despite the lack of evidence, the case did not fade quietly. Each of the 4 boys had family members who pushed for answers. Private investigators were hired. Lawsuits were filed and later dropped. Psychics offered theories. Fringe radio programs speculated about parallel dimensions, ley lines, and native curses. One guest claimed the cabin sat on a fault line between realities. His segment was never re-aired. The most disturbing detail came weeks later, when crime scene photos were reviewed again. In the background of one image, taken from the cabin doorway, an anomaly was noted. Through the back window, past the edge of the clearing, a faint figure stood between the trees. It was not seen during the initial review. It had no discernible features. No eyes, no face, just a tall, thin silhouette, almost blending into the tree trunks. It was dismissed as pareidolia, a trick of light and shadow. But the timestamp placed it at 7:43 a.m., after the cabin had been discovered but before law enforcement had secured the perimeter. The figure was never identified. Cabin 12 was boarded up 2 weeks later. The disappearance of the 4 boys remains one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases in state history. No trace of them was ever found. The official police investigation into the disappearance of the 4 boys from Cabin 12 stretched into months, then years, without progress. Initially classified as a high-priority missing persons case, the investigation involved local authorities, state police, the FBI, and various forensic experts. Each agency brought its own methodology, but all came away with the same conclusion. The event defied logic. There was no point of entry, no struggle, no noise, no signs of departure, voluntary or forced. Early interviews were rear-viewed multiple times. The counselors' timelines aligned almost too perfectly, without contradiction. Cabin checks were recorded at consistent intervals. One logbook listed a 12 OK note at 10:05 p.m., confirmed by a signature and timestamp. The next entry at 7:18 a.m. was marked Cabin 12, no answer, door locked. What should have existed in the intervening hours? A scuffle, a scream, a flicker of movement? Simply didn't. The windows had been examined carefully. Each latch was intact. No glass was broken. No footprints led to or from them, and the muddy ground outside remained pristine. One investigator tried to replicate a possible exit through the rear window. It proved nearly impossible to open from inside without making significant noise or disturbing the sill dust. There was no evidence anyone had tried. Forensics returned inconclusive. No DNA traces other than the boys and previous campers. No foreign fibers. No soil samples that indicated outside contamination. The black residue of the handprint failed to match any known materials. Multiple labs, including those used in industrial and chemical research, attempted to recreate its composition. All failed. The substance didn't respond to standard solvents. It didn't flake or smear. It remained fixed, dry, dead, and inexplicably resistant to analysis. The layout of the cabin was reconstructed in a controlled environment by the State Forensic Unit. The investigators attempted to test for gas leaks, carbon monoxide exposure, or sleep paralysis-inducing conditions. No leaks were found. Oxygen levels were normal. A full air quality report returned unremarkable data. Radon levels were slightly elevated, but not dangerously so. No hallucinogens were found in the air, water, or cabin food supply. All environmental explanations were ruled out. Attention then turned to the boys themselves. Their school records, medical histories, behavioral patterns, and family dynamics were scrutinized. None of the boys had prior history of running away. None had expressed suicidal ideation. None were medicated. None had significant disciplinary issues at home or school. Their backgrounds, while varied, had nothing in common beyond the camp. They didn't live in the same cities. They didn't know each other before arriving. They weren't connected through any digital communication. No emails, no phone calls. They had simply been assigned the same cabin through routine scheduling. A psychological profile was developed to search for possible group dynamics that could explain collective behavior, mass hysteria, shared delusions, a coordinated runaway attempt. But nothing supported that theory. The age range, personalities, and pre-existing psychological traits didn't match any known pattern of collective flight or psychogenic disorder. A runaway scenario would have left a trail, footprints, discarded items, sightings along the highway. There were none. Investigators examined the camp's land records, hoping to find something, anything, that might point to a buried history. The land Black Hollow Retreat sat on had once been part of a private reserve purchased in the late 1800s. Before that, it had passed through logging companies, a failed mining claim, and a brief ownership by a spiritualist commune that dissolved in the 1930s. One document mentioned quiet land not suited for habitation, a phrase repeated in multiple early deeds. Another stated, "The ground does not hold warmth." Still, there were no reported crimes or unexplained deaths tied to property on public record. One older local, a retired surveyor, provided an account of his team refusing to spend the night near the lake back in 1958. He said the area was strange and that their equipment kept failing. But no documentation supported his claim, and his testimony was deemed anecdotal. Others in the nearby town of Dedham recounted eerie stories from their grandparents of lost hikers, lights in the trees, or animals found strangely still. None of it was actionable. In the absence of evidence, rumors began to fill the void. Theories ranged from plausible to absurd. Some speculated about human trafficking, though the logistics made no sense. Others suggested supernatural involvement, abduction by entities unknown, a thinning of reality, a portal hidden beneath the cabin. Online forums developed detailed conspiracy threads about ley lines, ancient burial sites, government experiments. None of it led to answers. Eventually, the investigation began to lose momentum. Months turned into years. Personnel were reassigned. Budgets were reallocated. The case remained open but inactive. A cold file in a locked cabinet marked only with the date and the words Cabin 12 for juveniles unresolved. For a brief time, a task force revisited the case after an anonymous letter was sent to the Dedham police station in 1998. It read only, "They didn't leave. The cabin took them." The envelope contained no fingerprints, no return address, no DNA, no clues. The handwriting was compared against school records, staff files, and other anonymous tips. No match. Afterward, interest declined. Cabin 12 remained shuttered. In the months following the disappearance, the families of the 4 boys from Cabin 12 found themselves suspended in a kind of grief that had no shape. There were no answers, no funerals, no places to lay flowers. Their sons were gone and yet not declared dead, vanished, and yet not known to be taken. Each family experienced the absence differently, but all shared the same unbearable truth. The world would not stop for a mystery. At first, hope held a strange kind of weight. It arrived in the form of late-night phone calls, roadside sightings, reports of runaways fitting vague descriptions. Every ring of the telephone, every knock at the door brought a painful flicker of possibility. In the early weeks, the parents clung to belief, believing perhaps their boys had wandered off, maybe gotten lost, maybe scared and hiding in the woods. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it carried them through the initial days of media interviews and police briefings. Flyers were posted. Rewards were offered. News stations ran segments. Photographs of the 4 boys, smiling in yearbook portraits or standing awkwardly in front of school lockers, were plastered across newspapers and bulletin boards. Their names were repeated like prayers: Thomas, Levi, Jordan, and Miles. Friends from home wrote letters to the camp. Some were returned unopened. Others were never sent. As weeks passed and the trail remained cold, hope began to shift into something else, a hollowing. Some parents turned inward, avoiding interviews and visits from investigators. Others became advocates, appearing on talk shows, raising awareness, starting foundations. One mother began a weekly walk along the edge of the same woods where the camp sat, retracing the search grid. Another father recorded daily cassette messages to his missing son, reading news headlines and describing the weather, keeping the boy alive in ritual. For the siblings left behind, the silence was even stranger. Bedrooms were kept untouched. School desks remained empty. Some siblings refused to speak their brother's name, while others wore their clothes, slept in their beds, and listened to old voicemails just to hear a voice that was beginning to fade from memory. Counselors were brought in to support the schools, but few had answers for what could not be explained. The parents' relationships with each other grew complicated. In the early days, they leaned on one another. Meetings were held. Phone trees were formed. Group vigils were planned. But over time, tension surfaced. Some believed more should have been done. Others questioned the camp's responsibility. A few began to drift from the group entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had been lost. The shared grief once binding, began to isolate. Holidays passed in quiet ceremony. Birthdays became days of mourning. Every July, the anniversary brought a new wave of attention. Reporters reaching out, podcasts revisiting the case, amateur sleuths contacting the families with theories, dreams, or maps marked with circles. Each year the boys did not return. The space around their absence grew larger, more silent, and less visible to the outside world. Legally, the boys remained classified as missing persons. After 7 years, families were permitted to file for a death certificate in absentia. Only 2 did. The other 2 refused. The certificates felt like surrender, as if accepting a line had been drawn under something never fully written. One mother moved across the country and changed her last name. Another transformed her grief into a mission, founding a nonprofit for families of missing children. She later admitted in an interview that she never expected to find her son alive, but she couldn't live with the idea that he had been forgotten. Another father, who rarely spoke to the press, kept a locked drawer at his desk filled with old camp brochures, maps of the forest, and every newspaper clipping ever written about the case. In the center, a folded drawing his son had made the week before camp, a sketch of trees with eyes. The emotional toll was immense. Marriages ended. Jobs were lost. Faith was tested. Some parents admitted to experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing their sons' voices in the next room, feeling the weight of them sitting on the edge of the bed. These moments, though brief, left deep marks. Therapists called it trauma echo. The families called it haunting. Years later, when asked if closure was possible, most answered with silence. One simply said, "Closure is for people who get to bury their dead." Cabin 12, though boarded up, became a point of pilgrimage for some. Candles were left at its doorstep, toy soldiers, folded paper cranes. A photo once taped to the door showed the 4 boys at dinner on the camp's first night, laughing, unaware, unburdened. It was found damp, smeared by rain, but still intact. No family ever returned to Black Hollow once the camp closed, but none of them ever really left it behind. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearances, Black Hollow Retreat suspended all future sessions. Officially, the camp cited ongoing investigation and staff well-being as reasons for the closure, but few doubted that Cabin 12 was the true cause. The silence surrounding the cabin grew heavier with time, as if the very structure held on to the absence. Staff members who had stayed behind to assist investigators quietly resigned in the following weeks. By September of 1993, the camp sat empty, its paths overgrown, and cabins locked. Only the main lodge remained in occasional use, visited by law enforcement or property officials during their final assessments. What had once been a sanctuary of peace and routine was now marked by unease. The trees around the clearing seemed to shift subtly with the seasons, pressing in closer than before. Even wildlife patterns changed. Squirrels avoided the area. Birds no longer nested near the eaves. The lake, once alive with campers' laughter and canoe paddles, reflected nothing but gray stillness. The water's edge grew muddy, its shape gradually softening, as though the place were erasing its own borders. Administrators tried for a time to reclaim the land. The camp's director filed paperwork to reopen the facility the following year under a new name. A rebrand meant a break from the shadow of what had occurred. Plans were drawn to renovate the cabins, repurpose the site for silent meditation retreats, even sell it to a local wilderness therapy program. None of the proposals moved forward. Funding dried up. Insurance costs skyrocketed. The retreat, once known for tranquility, now appeared in national headlines and late-night radio specials. The words Black Hollow had shifted in tone from serene to sinister. Legal pressure mounted. The families of the missing boys, along with community activists, demanded that the camp remain permanently closed. Lawsuits were threatened, though none fully materialized. The camp's legal counsel advised minimizing publicity. In a quiet boardroom in Bangor, the board of directors signed a unanimous resolution. Black Hollow Retreat would not reopen. The land would be left fallow. The cabins, including Cabin 12, would remain as they were, sealed, uninhabited, and unmarked. That winter, a groundskeeper assigned to monitor the property submitted several maintenance logs, noting unusual weathering around Cabin 12. Despite snowfall being consistent across the property, the cabin's roof was often bare by morning, as though the snow refused to settle there. One entry described condensation forming on the inside of the windows, even though the structure had no working heat. Another mentioned finding the cabin door ajar, its interior undisturbed, and no prints in the snow leading to or from it. By the spring of 1994, multiple staff members who had been present during the summer of the incident reported persistent dreams. Though varied in content, the common theme was always Cabin 12. Its door opening slowly, with the sound of voices speaking from beneath the floorboards. Some dreamt of children calling out, not in fear, but in calm, echoing tones. A few sought therapy. Others moved away entirely. One refused to speak about the camp ever again, despite working there for over a decade. The local town council passed a quiet zoning ordinance that reclassified the land surrounding Black Hollow as undeveloped ecological buffer, preventing future construction or commercial activity. Residents supported the measure. While no one spoke openly to camp, most seemed relieved by its fading presence. A map printed by the county a year later omitted the name entirely. The site was reduced to a blank patch of forest, marked only by a gravel access road and a closed gate. Years later, attempt to auction the land failed. Bidders withdrew after visiting the property. One wrote that the air felt wrong and described an oppressive silence that followed him long after leaving. No sale was completed. By 2001, the land was considered abandoned. Nature resumed its course. The grass overtook the gravel paths. The docks splintered and collapsed into the lake. The cabins, once cleaned weekly, fell into disrepair. Roof shingles scattered, vines curling through broken window panes. Cabin 12 remained largely intact. Its door stayed shut, its foundation steady, its windows unbroken. Moss grew along its outer walls. Spiders nested beneath the porch. Still, it retained a stillness that was different from the rest. Too preserved, too unchanged. Even the paint faded slower. The handprint on the ceiling, though never publicly photographed, was reported to still exist, unchanged, visible only in certain light. Occasionally, local teenagers dared each other to find it. Most never reached the clearing. Those who did rarely entered. One claimed the floorboards were warm beneath his feet. Another said he heard breathing, though he was alone. Urban legends bloomed. They said the boys had never left, that the cabin was a trap, that those who slept in it heard whispers telling them to stay. In the official records of Hancock County, Black Hollow Retreat is listed as permanently inactive. No utility bills are paid. No mail is delivered. No trespassing signs are posted around the perimeter. Law enforcement, when asked, insists the case remains open, but no further action is expected. Cabin 12 still stands, untouched, waiting beneath the trees. Long after the headlines faded and the search was called off, letters kept arriving. They came in regular envelopes, with carefully printed addresses and return labels from places all over the country. Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and farther. Some were written by classmates, others by distant relatives, and many by people who had never met the boys from Cabin 12. Most contained simple messages. We miss you. I hope you're safe. Come home if you can. Each carried a kind of quiet belief that maybe, somewhere, someone would receive it. These letters were never opened. They were stored in cardboard boxes in the Dedham post office, kept behind the clerk's station with a handwritten label, Retreat Mail, hold indefinitely. By the late 1990s, there were nearly 200 of them, some yellowed with time. Others remained pristine, sealed and stamped, never returned to sender. A few had drawings inside, stick figures of 4 boys holding hands, shaded cabins under smiling suns, trees with eyes, stars above the roof. Postal workers didn't know what to do with them, but no one felt comfortable throwing them away. Alongside the unopened letters were forgotten dreams. The families of the missing boys began to speak less frequently of the dreams, afraid that acknowledging them would only deepen the distance between themselves and reality. But they continued, quietly. Some were recurring, variations of the same scene, revisited night after night with subtle shifts. One mother dreamt that her son stood outside the cabin, always just out of reach, mouthing words she could never hear. Each time she tried to walk toward him, the forest pulled back, the trees parting like curtains and swallowing him in shadow. A brother once described a dream in which all 4 boys were asleep in their bunks, perfectly still, and a low hum filled the room. Not mechanical, not musical, but biological, like breath or blood moving through something unseen. He woke up with his ears ringing. That morning, he couldn't recall what day it was. The sensation passed by noon, but he never slept in silence again. He began leaving the TV on, even if it was just static. These dreams were not nightmares in the traditional sense. There was no screaming, no visible terror. They left instead a residue of dread, a sense of dislocation that lingered into daylight. Some dreamers described a heaviness in their chest upon waking. Others spoke of the persistent smell of damp pine, or the feeling of wooden floorboards underfoot, even in carpeted rooms. One investigator who had worked the case reported seeing a dream therapist years after retiring. He confessed that every few months he still dreamt of Cabin 12. Not the event, not the boys, just the structure, standing alone in the woods, untouched by time, its door always slightly open. In his dream, he never approached. He only watched from a distance, unable to move. The therapist said it was a symbol of unresolved responsibility. He wasn't sure he believed that. Dreams from people unrelated to the case were occasionally mailed in written on line paper, recorded on cassette tapes, sent anonymously. Most were vague, but a few shared strange consistencies. A description of a red thread stretched across a cabin ceiling, a cold presence behind a wooden door, a handprint above a bed. One letter came from a retired firefighter in Oregon who claimed to have never heard of the Black Hollow case before his dream. He said he woke up with dirt under his fingernails and the sensation that something had been watching him breathe. Some of the families tried to interpret the dreams as signs. Others viewed them as psychological wounds reopening in the subconscious. The more time passed, the harder it became to know what was memory, what was imagination, and what might be something else entirely. They stopped discussing them publicly, not because they stopped having them, but because they no longer wanted strangers turning their private grief into symbols. Unsent letters were also found in the boys' homes, written drafts tucked into drawers or under mattresses. Some were started at the camp before the disappearance. "Dear Mom, I miss you. Can you send more socks?" There's something weird about the woods. One letter, undated and unsigned, was discovered in a sketch pad belonging to one of the boys. The paper was partially torn, but the legible lines read, "It's not a cabin, it's a mouth, and we're inside it." For years, those words haunted the parents more than any dream. They tried to convince themselves it was a metaphor, a child's overactive imagination, a private joke. But the phrasing stuck. The image took root, the idea that something had swallowed their children, quietly and without struggle, in the middle of the night. Eventually, the letters slowed. People moved. Memories softened. The media turned its attention elsewhere. The boxes in the post office were sealed and moved to storage. The cassette tapes were stored in plastic bags, their labels faded. The drawings crumbled with time. Still, some dreams returned. Not every night, not even every month, but enough. Enough to keep the silence from fully closing. After the camp closed and the investigation faded from headlines, the story of Cabin 12 did not disappear. It simply changed form. In the absence of explanations, stories took root. Rumors, whispers, and fragments of memory passed from person to person, reshaping the truth into something darker, more primal, and strangely more believable to those who heard it late at night. The facts of the case, the 4 missing boys, the locked door, the untouched beds, were soon overlaid with the weight of folklore. It began, as many such tales do, with teenagers. In the surrounding towns, Dedham, Ellsworth, Orland, local kids turned the mystery into a rite of passage. They dared each other to find Black Hollow, to sneak past the rusted gate, to reach the edge of the woods where the gravel road turned to moss and broken pine needles. Some claimed to have made it to the edge of the camp, standing just far enough to glimpse the roofs of the cabins. A few swore they saw lights flickering in the trees or a window slowly opening without sound. None of them stayed long. Urban myths began to spiral outward from those accounts. One version claimed the boys had summoned something in the woods, a spirit, an entity, or worse, an echo, a figure that could only exist in silence. Another told of a fifth camper, erased from records, who returned home but never spoke again. There was talk of an underground tunnel system beneath the camp, of ritual carvings hidden in floorboards, of dream maps found etched into trees. Stories vary by region and year, but certain details remain disturbingly consistent. The handprint, the hum, the feeling of being watched from just outside the cabin door. Each version differed in shape, but not in tone. They were quiet stories, slow, never frantic or loud. The terror was always subtle, like a cold breath on the back of the neck, or the weight of being observed while you slept. Online message boards kept the myth alive. By the early 2000s, true crime forums and paranormal subreddits began dissecting the Black Hollow disappearance with new intensity. Grainy satellite images of the camp were shared and analyzed. One user posted coordinates that, when entered into Google Earth, showed a clearing surrounded by trees that cast no shadows. Another claimed that audio files recorded near the property picked up frequencies too low for human ears, vibrations rather than sound, consistent with infrasonic resonance. Photoshopped images circulated, adding to the confusion. A popular fake showed a blurry figure standing in Cabin 12's window with two handprints on the glass. Another falsely claimed to show crime scene photos, though they were traced back to unrelated locations. Skeptics dismissed the entire affair as myth-making and mass delusion, but believers persisted, especially those who lived near the site. Too many locals had heard too much for too long to dismiss the story outright. Campfire tales bloomed around the core mystery. Children of former counselors, hearing only fragments of what their parents refused to discuss, filled in the blanks with their own ideas. One story told of a camper who returned to his hometown 10 years later, unaware that he'd ever been gone. Another claimed that Cabin 12 was not built over Earth, but over a hollow, a pocket in the ground where time folded. The wildest tales claimed that the boys had not disappeared, but shifted, phased out of sync, trapped between seconds, forever conscious but unreachable. College students wrote short horror fiction inspired by the story. Indie filmmakers tried to adapt it. Podcasts devoted episodes to unraveling its details. Every retelling added something. An echo, a shadow, a movement seen only in reflection. Some told of visitors standing at the door to Cabin 12 and hearing their own voices whispering from inside, saying things they had never said before. Others warned that anyone who stayed too long would lose track of time, forget their own name, or find themselves unable to leave the forest. Psychics offered their theories. They spoke of energy pools, of dimensional rips, of thin places where reality softened. One claimed the cabin functioned as a beacon, calling to those who felt unseen. Another referred to it as a trap for grief, a structure that fed on longing and loss. The more people remembered the boys, the stronger it grew. To this day, no verified accounts exist of someone spending a night in Cabin 12. Every report ends the same way. The visitor leaves before dark, compelled by a discomfort they cannot name. A few left offerings, a photo, a note, a carved figurine, then walk back down the path without looking behind them. They all describe the same feeling upon departure. Not fear exactly, but dislocation. A sense that something was no longer following them, but watching just the same. The real story, buried under years of speculation and secrecy, remains locked in boxes, in archived police files, in the memories of a few aging counselors who refuse to be interviewed. But the myths have flourished in their absence. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part. Not that the truth has been lost, but that the fiction has become more comfortable, more known, more accepted, as if the truth had gone silent and the whispers had replaced it. In the fall of 2005, more than a decade after the closure of Black Hollow Retreat, a box was discovered during the renovation of a farmhouse once rented by seasonal camp staff. The house, situated 20 miles from the camp, had been abandoned for years, its structure half collapsed, its roof open to weather. Beneath a warped floorboard in the upstairs bedroom, a tenant stumbled across a small wooden box, sealed, weather-stained, and wrapped in plastic. Inside, protected from mold and time, was a leather-bound journal with the name A. Cormer written on the inner flap. Alan Cormer had been a junior counselor assigned to Cabin 9 during the summer of the disappearance. He had never been a suspect, never central to the investigation, and had faded into the background once the camp shut down. His name appeared on a handful of official reports, mostly in routine logs and check-in sheets, but he hadn't been quoted in the press or interviewed on record more than once. His resignation came days after the investigation stalled, citing emotional distress. He left the state the following year. The journal appeared to be his personal account of the weeks leading up to and following July 18, 1993. The handwriting was uneven in places, at times steady and reflective, at others hurried and slanted, as if written in the dark or under duress. The early entries were mundane. Notes on camper behavior, supply shortages, staff gossip. Then, around mid-July, the tone began to shift. One entry mentioned a low, pulsing noise near cabin 12 at night, described not as a sound, but as a pressure behind the ears. Another noted that the boys assigned to that cabin had stopped attending certain activities, not by refusal, but by accident. They had begun showing up to the wrong events, out of sync with the schedule, always claiming to have been told differently by someone unnamed. Several pages referenced strange behavior in animals. Cormer wrote about a bird crashing into the mess hall window 3 nights in a row, always at the same hour, always fatally. He noted that the camp dogs refused to go near the fire pit closest to cabin 12. One dog, previously calm and well-behaved, had to be put down after a sudden and unexplained attack on a counselor walking toward the woods. The most chilling entry was dated July 17th, the night before the disappearance. In it, Cormer described a dream he had experienced 3 nights in a row. He wrote that in the dream, he stood at the edge of the woods behind cabin 12, unable to move. The cabin glowed faintly, not from lantern light, but from something within the walls themselves. He saw the 4 boys inside, seated on their bunks, staring at the ceiling. They did not blink. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. One of them, whom he identified only as TL, was writing something on his arm in ash. When Cormer woke, he had scratches down his forearm he couldn't explain. The final entries, written after the event, were fragmented and erratic. Phrases repeated. Entire sentences crossed out. He wrote of seeing flickers of motion in the trees during the search, even though no one else saw them. He mentioned hearing his name whispered from the dark when alone on perimeter checks. Most troubling was his repeated claim that cabin 12's door had been open at dawn on July 18th, though all official accounts stated it was latched from the inside. Cormer claimed to have walked halfway up the steps to the cabin before being called away by another counselor. He didn't mention this to the authorities. In the journal, he wrote, "The door was open, not wide, just enough. Enough to see that they weren't in their beds. Enough to feel the air coming out. Cold, not like morning cold. A different kind. Hollow." He ended the entry by writing the same phrase 5 times. They didn't leave. After the discovery, the journal was reviewed by a forensic document examiner. The ink was consistent with pens manufactured in the early 1990s. The handwriting matched known samples from Alan Cormer's personnel file. No evidence suggested forgery. Despite this, the journal was never officially added to the case file. By that time, the investigation had long since gone cold, and officials viewed the content as anecdotal at best, delusional at worst. Cormer was never located. His last known residence was in Idaho, where he worked for a logging company for 2 years before disappearing from public records. His phone number was disconnected, and no forwarding address was ever provided. Former colleagues remembered him as quiet, distant, and always looking over his shoulder. To this day, the journal remains in private possession, passed quietly between investigators, writers, and curious collectors. Its contents have never been fully published. Select pages have appeared in obscure forums and on fringe podcasts, often misquoted, sometimes altered. The original remains intact, weathered, bound in soft leather, and smelling faintly of pine. Some believe it holds the only truthful account of what really happened at Black Hollow. Others believe it's just one more whisper in the silence left behind. More than a decade after the closure of Black Hollow Retreat, a curious symbol began to appear in places connected, directly or loosely, to the case. A spiral, etched crudely, always counterclockwise, made with whatever medium was available. Charcoal, ink, paint, even nail gouges on wood. It started as a coincidence, or what appeared to be one, until the recurrence became difficult to ignore. The first known reappearance came in 2006, in the margins of a high school notebook belonging to a student whose older cousin had once attended Black Hollow. The student doodled spirals repeatedly on the page, unaware of their shape's significance. When questioned, they claimed it was simply something that felt natural to draw. That same year, a retired forest ranger cataloging tree growth patterns near the abandoned camp noted strange carvings near the old fire trail, a spiral pattern in bark that didn't match any known wildlife behavior. By 2008, reports increased. The spiral was found burned into a plywood sheet, left behind in cabin 11. A former counselor who returned briefly to property said he discovered it under a warped mattress, charred black at the edges, untouched by weather. He did not report the finding to authorities. Instead, he took a photograph, later posted anonymously online. The image showed a jagged, counterclockwise curl, uneven and hastily marked, centered over a split in the wood. In the town of Dedham, the symbol appeared on the inside of a bus stop shelter during a cold autumn morning, drawn in condensation from someone's finger. It disappeared by noon but was seen by at least 6 commuters. A few days later, it reappeared on the rear window of a parked vehicle outside the library, again traced in fog glass. No fingerprints were recoverable. A librarian claimed she'd seen the same spiral on the back of a boy's notebook in 1993, just days before the Black Hollow incident. Digital spaces began to take notice. On message boards dedicated to unsolved cases and paranormal phenomena, the spiral became a topic of fascination. Users traced its appearance across multiple contexts. On the walls of an abandoned cabin in Utah, on a missing persons flyer altered by an unknown hand, on the sleeve of a child's drawing found in a thrift store in Vermont. None of these instances were connected in any official capacity, but those who followed the Black Hollow case noticed a disturbing pattern. Each time the spiral appeared, it was near a place of silence, vacant homes, lost children, disappearances never solved. Linguists and folklorists tried to make sense of the spiral's shape. It did not match traditional sigils, nor did align cleanly with symbols from recognized esoteric traditions. It was too rough for Celtic influence, too disordered for mathematical precision, and lacked the symmetry seen in ritual glyphs. Still, there was something familiar about it, primitive, intuitive, as if it belonged to a language that had been forgotten rather than invented. A psychologist researching collective memory proposed that the spiral was an unconscious imprint, an image formed in the minds of those exposed to certain kinds of trauma or liminality. He suggested it functioned like a mental scar, a mnemonic wound repeating itself through gesture. When he published a paper on the theory, he received over 30 emails from individuals claiming to have drawn or dreamt the spiral without knowing why. A few described seeing it on the ceiling while falling asleep. One wrote that her son began tracing it into the carpet with his finger before he went missing in 2011. Law enforcement largely dismissed the symbol as coincidence, amplified by internet speculation. None of the recovered spirals were directly linked to criminal activity, and in most cases, they were attributed to hoaxes or pareidolia. Yet within the Black Hollow case file, a page from the forensic notes listed possible symbols, spiral, next to a drawing sketched during early evidence collection. It was dated July 24th, 1993, and had been copied from an impression found faintly on the underside of a bunk board in cabin 12. That detail was never included in the public records. An artist in Maine who had studied the case for years recreated the spiral in metal, forming it into a small pendant he wore for protection. After several months, he reported having recurring dreams of a forest clearing where a cabin sat with no doors. He stopped wearing the pendant after waking one morning with ash under his fingernails and no memory of the night. The spiral continued to surface in increasingly obscure places, carved into bathroom stalls, scratched into tree trunks, burned faintly into the cover of a child's lost journal. Always counterclockwise, always alone, no accompanying words, no signs, no context, just a curl, wide at first then tighter, as if leading inward into something unseen. Some believed it to be a mark, a signature left behind by whatever had taken the boys from cabin 12. Others thought it a warning. A few, more grimly, suspected it to be a map, a direction inward, or a door. Over time, as the official version of the Black Hollow case became fossilized in public memory, 4 boys, 1 cabin, no explanation, a quieter theory began to surface among those who had studied the disappearance closely. It didn't originate with any police report or televised segment, but rather with inconsistencies buried deep in archival documents, handwritten notes, and anecdotal recollections. It was called the 5th name theory. The premise was simple but disturbing, that there was a 5th boy in cabin 12 that summer. Not 4 campers, but 5. The earliest hint came from a counselor's schedule recovered during a Freedom of Information Act request. The page, dated July 12, 1993, listed bed assignments for cabin 12. 5 names were handwritten in block letters: Thomas, Levi, Jordan, Miles, and 1 more scratched out in dark ink. The name was illegible, obscured under multiple strokes of a black felt pen. Later copies of the same document, entered into the official investigation, showed only 4 names neatly typed, with no signs of alteration. A parent of one of the missing boys once mentioned 5 backpacks being lined up outside the cabin during their arrival at the camp. At the time, it was dismissed as a misremembered detail. But similar reports emerged from 2 other staff members, both describing an initial head count of 5 boys for cabin 12, corrected to 4 by the end of the first week. Neither could recall which name had been removed, only that the number seemed to shrink overnight, without anyone acknowledging it. This anomaly remained dormant for years, until a digital archivist cross-referenced an early camper roster with scanned registration forms. The form for cabin 12 had space for 5 names, all numbered. The 5th line was filled in with the letters Yale. The rest had been erased with whiteout. The handwriting did not match that of the camp's director or admin staff, suggesting the addition had been made after the official filing. There were no initials Yale in the camp's enrollment records that year, nor in any prior year. The missing name was a puzzle with no shape, no photograph, no family, no school records. No one had ever reported a 5th boy missing. There was no open case file, no official notice, and yet the evidence kept surfacing in the margins. In 2010, an anonymous email was sent to a true crime blogger who had been covering the Black Hollow mystery extensively. The message consisted of just 1 sentence: ask why only 4 were missed. Attached was a scanned image of a letter dated July 19, 1993. The letter was a camp memo reporting on the disappearance and informing certain families of the developing investigation. It included a list of camper cabins with occupancy totals. Cabin 12 was labeled 5 assigned for reported. The memo had not been released publicly. The blogger attempted to verify its authenticity, but the original sender never responded again. Discussion around the 5th name theory remained fringe until a retired investigator confirmed in a podcast interview that early in the investigation, a single bunk in cabin 12 had shown no signs of use. No sheets disturbed, no belongings unpacked, no shoes under the frame. This had been interpreted as a clerical error in bed assignments. But looking back, he admitted, there had always been something off about the math. The idea of an unremembered camper began to haunt the online communities surrounding the case. Forum users created timelines, bunk maps, name lists, and speculative theories. One theory suggested that the 5th boy had never existed physically, but was part of shared hallucination or mass false memory. Another proposed that he had been erased intentionally, by the entity responsible or by those trying to suppress what happened. In one chilling development, a former camper who had stayed in cabin 11 during the same session wrote that he remembered playing cards with 5 boys from cabin 12 on the second night of camp. When he later saw the names of the missing children in the news, he said one was missing from the list. He couldn't remember the name, but he recalled that the boy had weird eyes and always sat closest to the cabin door. Some speculated that the 5th boy had never been a camper at all, but something else, wherein form a child, placed among them without detection, that he had arrived with no paperwork, no family, no past, a hitchhiker in the fabric of the camp's reality, and that when he left, he took the others with him, not through violence or force, but through invitation. This theory gained traction after a strange entry from a forgotten counselor's journal resurfaced. One line read, "There was a boy at dinner who didn't eat. No tray, no seat assigned. I can't find him in the roll sheet. No one else noticed. Despite the growing intrigue, no official action was ever taken to pursue the theory. Law enforcement dismissed the idea as a distortion created by the passage of time and collective obsession. Psychologists warned about the fallibility of memory, especially under stress. But for those who had spent years collecting fragments of the case, the fifth name theory remained the most unsettling possibility of all. Not just that someone had vanished without a trace, but that someone had been there who was never meant to be. A presence unnoticed, a name unspoken, and perhaps the first to go missing, not on the night of July 18th, but long before anyone realized he was even there. In the summer of 1997, for years after the disappearance at Black Hollow Retreat, a small incident occurred at a remote body of water known as Mirror Lake, located approximately 8 miles north of the abandoned campgrounds. Though the event received minimal attention at the time, it would later be revisited by amateur investigators who believed it bore unsettling echoes of Cabin 12. Mirror Lake was rarely visited. Less scenic than other local lakes, hard to access, and absent from most modern maps. It was small and still, ringed with dense pine and birch, its surface dark enough to reflect nearly perfect images of surrounding trees and sky. Locals avoided it not out of superstition, but out of disinterest. There were no trails, no campsites, no posted signs. The lake simply existed, quiet and overlooked. That July, 2 hikers from a nearby town came across the lake while following an old logging path. They noted its uncanny stillness. No ripples, no birdsong. The trees around its edge, according to their later statement, seemed unnaturally uniform, equal in height, bent slightly toward the water. They did not stay long. Before leaving, one of them snapped a Polaroid photo. When it developed, they noticed something unusual, a faint distortion across the surface of the lake. Not a reflection, but a swirling blur like a spiral caught mid-formation. They dismissed it as a camera flaw. 2 weeks later, a local teenager named Danny Cray went missing while hiking with friends near that same trail. They'd split off from a group for just 10 minutes, intending to find a secluded spot to smoke. When his friends returned, he was gone. No sounds. No struggle. His backpack was found near the edge of the lake, upright and zipped. A faint depression in the grass suggested he had been sitting. The only disturbance was a single set of wet footprints leading toward the water. No return prints, no drag marks, no signs of slipping. It was as though he had walked in and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash. His disappearance was investigated, but quickly deemed a tragic accident. The lake was searched. Divers called in. Nothing was recovered. No body, no clothing, no evidence. His case file, thin and unfinished, remains marked as missing, presumed drowned. But Mirror Lake was no more than 12 feet deep, and the silt bottom, once disturbed, should have revealed something. The divers described visibility as unnaturally poor. One reported hearing a low hum during descent, like a vibrating string under pressure. In the years that followed, a pattern of anomalies surrounded the lake. Campers who wandered near its banks described moments of disorientation, losing track of time, hearing voices muffled under the water, or seeing ripples without wind. One couple, resting near the shore on a late afternoon hike, claimed they heard children laughing from across the lake, though they saw no one. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Stranger still were the reflections. Multiple individuals described seeing their own images in the water move differently than their bodies, delayed, hesitant, or turning when they themselves did not. A park ranger once recorded himself standing at the edge of the lake and compared the footage to his reflection. For 2 seconds, the reflection did not raise its arm when he waved. The footage was dismissed as a video glitch. The lake gained a quiet reputation among locals as not right, not haunted, not cursed, just wrong in a way no one could name. Children were told not to go near it, and hikers often changed routes to avoid it. The trail leading to it grew less defined over time, as if even nature sought to conceal its presence. Connections to Black Hollow began when a blogger mapped the distance between the camp and the lake and found a direct line, 8 miles due north. On an old Forest Service map dated 1985, the same line had been marked faintly in red, labeled Perimeter Zone Do Not Survey. The reason for the boundary was never documented. More unsettling were the symbols carved into a fallen birch near the lake's southern bend. Crudely etched spirals, worn by rain and bark growth. They bore the same counterclockwise pattern found in Cabin 12 and later sightings. Nearby, someone had nailed a piece of wood to the tree's base with a single word burned into its surface. Listen. No one ever claimed responsibility for the sign. In the absence of official explanation, theories flourished. Some believed Mirror Lake was a second site, a parallel locus to Cabin 12, a place where boundaries between presence and absence thinned. Others thought the lake was a receiving point, a mouth rather than a trap. They argued that the spiral was not just a mark but a directional tool, pulling the missing not downward but inward, to wherever silence became substance. One particularly persistent belief held that Mirror Lake had always been connected to the camp, that the boys had dreamed of it before they vanished, that one of them had drawn it in charcoal on the underside of a bunk, round, dark, still, with no shorelines marked. To this day, no new trails have been cleared near Mirror Lake. The area remains unmaintained, and no camping is permitted within a 2-mile radius. Those who visit often leave quickly, and those who stay report strange dreams for weeks afterward. The lake, like the cabin, does not call. It waits. In the winter of 2008, a sound technician working for a small public radio station in rural Maine uncovered a series of strange frequency charts tucked away in a mislabeled folder in the station's storage room. The folder, dated August 1993, had been stored with old field recordings and defunct community news projects. Inside were 7 hand-drawn maps, each marked with geographic grid lines, red pins, and faint contour lines, alongside printed waveform readouts of low-frequency sound data recorded from northern Hancock County in the weeks following the Black Hollow disappearance. The maps were not official government documents. They bore no agency insignia, no formal legends. Instead, each featured a prominent ring, expanding outward from a central point that corresponded, almost exactly, with the location of Cabin 12. At the bottom corner of each map was a label, stamped rather than printed, Zone of Inhibited Acoustic Presence. The technician, unfamiliar with the term, began referring to them as silence maps. At first glance, the charts appeared meaningless, a collection of outdated technical data from old environmental sensors. But when the technician overlaid them onto updated satellite maps of the region, the pattern became clearer. The areas marked by the silence rings didn't reflect topography or human activity. They reflected sound, or more specifically, the absence of it. The red rings aligned with regions where sound, both natural and man-made, had been anomalously dampened. In one area, birdsong recordings dipped to near total silence for a period of 6 hours. In another, a scout troop reported that campfire sounds were muffled, voices swallowed by the night, footsteps muted on gravel. None of these events were originally connected to the Black Hollow case. At the time, they had been explained away as equipment malfunctions or atmospheric quirks. Yet the waveform graphs told a different story. They showed a consistent pattern of subsonic interference, low vibrations that didn't register in real-time monitoring but became apparent when the data was compressed. Frequencies between 17 Hz and 19 Hz appeared in nearly every recording, frequencies known to cause feelings of unease, nausea, and even hallucinations in some people. Infrasound, as it's known, is often blamed for hauntings. It rattles the body below the threshold of hearing, a ghostly presence with no sound. The technician, curious and increasingly disturbed, contacted a retired audio engineer who had previously consulted for regional emergency services. After reviewing the materials, the engineer quietly confirmed that the maps bore similarities to experimental acoustic suppression models developed in the early 1980s, projects designed to track zones where radio signals, voice communication, or sound propagation failed unexpectedly. These maps have been created by private contractors, and according to rumor, one such study had been conducted near Dedham in the early 90s, then abruptly terminated. Among the documents was something stranger still, a typed transcript labeled WCBH Unsent Broadcast, July 20th, 1993, 1:43 a.m. It consisted of only 7 lines, short and vague, typed in all caps. The forest has adjusted. for return different. A door is not a door. The mouth forgot to close. No names. No faces. Do not speak the ceiling. Listen backwards. The station had no record of ever preparing or airing such a segment. The file was not listed in their archival system. The timestamp matched the period when no staff were scheduled to broadcast. According to logbooks, that hour was static. Speculation spread quickly in the darker corners of the internet. Some believed the broadcast had been sent out in error, a signal not meant for public transmission, but for a different audience altogether. Others saw it as a failed warning, intercepted before it could be aired. A few theorized that the message wasn't typed by a person at all, but generated by an anomaly, an echo formed by silence itself, imitating structure, borrowing language. Cryptographers attempted to decode the lines. Listen backwards was taken literally by some, leading to reverse audio experiments using known sound samples from a region. One recording, captured near Mirror Lake, when reversed and slowed, produced a pattern resembling breath. Not wind, not mechanical noise, just breath, slow and steady, growing closer, then abruptly stopping. Further investigation into the radio station's history revealed a peculiar detail. WCBH had once operated as a shortwave signal relay during the 1970s for civil defense testing. The broadcast equipment had capabilities far beyond those required for community news. One local technician remembered being told not to tamper with the far knob, which controlled a frequency band labeled only as Deep Listen. Its use was never officially recorded. By 2011, the maps and waveform data had disappeared from public view. The technician who first uncovered them declined interviews and left the station within a year. The storage room where the documents had been found was sealed during a renovation and repurposed as a supply closet. The silence maps, if they still exist, now circulate only as low-resolution scans among a few researchers and archivists. But the pattern lingers. Reports continue of areas around Black Hollow where sound vanishes, not all at once, but gradually, like a volume knob turned slowly to zero. People walking through these spaces describe the sensation of pressure, the awareness that their own footsteps no longer echo, that their breath makes no sound. Some freeze mid-step. Others walk faster. No one stays long. Silence in most places is a void. Here, it's something with shape, something that listens back. In the fall of 2013, a child was found wandering the edge of a marshland just outside Penobscot County, not far from the disused roads leading toward Black Hollow. He appeared to be around 10 years old, barefoot, pale, and dressed in clothes several decades out of style. Canvas trousers, a plain wool sweater, and no jacket despite the cold. He carried no identification. His hands were clean. His hair was neatly combed. His first responders noted that, aside from appearing slightly dazed, he bore no visible injuries, no signs of exposure, and no dirt under his fingernails. The most immediate concern was that no one reported him missing. A door-to-door canvass of the nearby towns yielded nothing. Schools had no record of a recently absent student. No parent came forward. No regional alerts matched his description. He said his name was Caleb, but he could not recall a last name or the names of any family members. When asked where he was from, he simply pointed toward the North Woods. An intake nurse wrote in her report that the boy seemed untethered from time. Though physically healthy and articulate, he struggled to identify simple modern objects. He referred to the television as the picture cabinet and asked if the fluorescent hospital lights were sky traps. When given an iPad, he tried to talk to it as if it were a person. During meal times, he asked if he needed to say anything to be heard. When questioned further, he repeated the phrase, "You have to speak inwards if you want it to count." Then came the issue of his voice. More precisely, the absence of its echo. Hospital staff first noticed it during a routine examination in an empty hallway. When he spoke, there was no reverberation, none of the expected echo that comes naturally from hard walls and linoleum flooring. Doctors ran acoustic tests inside the soundproof audiology lab. A speaker played recorded tones to measure the room's response. Everything performed normally. But when the boy spoke from within the same chamber, the waveform analysis returned to flat line. His voice, while audible to human ear, did not register in the equipment. The frequency data showed a strange dip in mid-range resonance, as if his speech occurred outside the measurable field of typical vocal range, even though he sounded perfectly normal in conversation. Microphones recorded silence when aimed at his mouth, but ambient noise, footsteps, machines, distant traffic, captured without issue. One technician described the boy's voice as something your ears pick up but your brain doesn't store. Despite efforts to keep the case discreet, rumors spread quickly. A nurse claimed that her tape recorder failed 3 times while interviewing him. Another staff member, while attempting to record vitals, reported hearing her own voice repeating from the intercom system even though no one else heard it. There were no intercoms in that wing. A sleep study was arranged. During the night, the EEG readout showed that Caleb entered REM sleep within 3 minutes, anomalously fast. While dreaming, his eyes remained wide open. He did not blink. Cameras captured this, but the footage failed to retain audio. When reviewed the next morning, the video contained a soft distortion, subtle, rhythmic, like breath behind glass. The sound technician who reviewed the footage later resigned. In his exit interview, he described hearing a phrase layered deep in the static. Not him. Still open. Attempts to transfer the boy to foster care failed. Each assigned caregiver withdrew within a week, citing unexplained illnesses, mood disturbances, or a persistent feeling that the child was absent while present. One social worker stated she'd once entered a room to find Caleb sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at nothing. When she spoke to him, he responded clearly, but she could not remember what he had said. Her notes were blank. When shown photographs of the missing boy from cabin 12, Caleb studied them in silence, then said softly, "One of them asked to go back." He refused to clarify. No genetic matches were ever found. His DNA did not appear in any state or federal database. Dental records were inconclusive. His fingerprints matched no one. The wool sweater he wore, upon analysis, was found to contain pollen from a species of tree no longer native to the region. An ornithologist later identified a feather fragment sewn into the sleeve as belonging to a bird extinct since 1987. Over time, Caleb spoke less. He began spending long periods staring into corners or placing his ear against smooth surfaces, walls, windows, water tanks. When asked why, he would say, "I'm listening for the return." Then, one morning, he was gone. There were no signs of forced exit. The door to his room was locked from the inside. Security footage showed static during the hour of his disappearance. The final frame captured him standing still, looking directly at the camera with an unreadable expression. A white spiral had been drawn in chalk on the floor beneath his feet. The nurses insisted no such spiral had been there the night before. His bed was still made. His shoes remained neatly by the door. No new prints were found. The room was completely silent. The pine forests surrounding the abandoned grounds of Black Hollow Retreat have always been dense. Too dense, some say, for a camp to have ever been comfortably built within. Even in their healthiest stretches, the trees grow in unnatural alignment, their trunks too uniform in height and spacing. Their branches angle like ribs around something they are silently protecting. The forest doesn't speak the way other forests do. Wind moves through, but doesn't sing. Footsteps land, but don't echo. People walk beneath the pines and feel not watched, but noticed. Long after the disappearance of the 4 boys from cabin 12, the surrounding woods began to exhibit strange patterns. Trees near the edge of the property grew away from the camp, slightly leaning outward, their trunks bowed as though recoiling from an invisible center. Botanists attribute the phenomenon to phototropism, plants reacting to sunlight, but aerial surveys showed that even in evenly lit areas, the lean persisted. One forestry report from 2002 noted that rings inside the trees nearest the cabin displayed inconsistent growth, including a sudden, unexplained thinning of the rings corresponding to year 1993. It wasn't just the trees. The animals changed too. Small mammals stopped nesting in the immediate area. Bird song ceased within a half-mile perimeter. At least 2 amateur naturalists independently recorded silence in the region, moments when even insects fell quiet. A wildlife tracker once followed the trail of a deer into the area and found it looping in figure eights for nearly a mile, as if confused. Tracks showed no indication of injury, no predators, just endless looping until they stopped abruptly without exit. In 2009, a research drone flew over the area to collect thermal imaging data for a local university's environmental study. Most of the forest appeared as expected. Cool tones, dense foliage, but a perfect circular clearing, previously unmapped, showed an irregular heat signature at its center. No known geological activity was detected in the area, no buried electrical equipment, no reason for warmth. When a ground team returned to locate the clearing, they found no break in the tree line. The location was solid pine. The circle, they were told, did not exist. Locals began referring to certain parts of the forest as dead pockets. These were places where compasses failed, batteries drained, and dogs refused to enter. One such pocket lay directly behind the remains of Cabin 12. Park ranger performing a sweep in 2015 reported sudden bouts of dizziness and confusion when crossing that threshold. One ranger claimed to hear the distinct sound of a child humming a lullaby, soft and tuneless, but no other ranger heard it. His body camera showed only static during the time he reported the noise. Close to the heart of the forest, some of the older trees have developed unusual scar patterns, bark stripped in spirals, deep notches at precise intervals, too high for deer, too consistent for weather. One tree, felled in a storm, revealed a symbol carved into its core, beneath the rings in the wood's heart. A counterclockwise spiral, darkened with time, almost fossilized into grain. Dendrochronology experts called the mark impossible. It had been made when the tree was still young, far before it could have grown large enough to hide it. One researcher suggested it had been carved, then healed around. The forest remembers in rings and silence, in lean and absence. An elderly man who had worked as a logger in the region during the early 1980s recalled that certain parts of the woods sounded wrong even back then. He described the difference as something in the pitch of the wind to the needles, just slightly out of tune. He claimed one of his co-workers disappeared for several hours near what would later become Black Hollow's northern perimeter. When he returned, he was quiet. His watch had stopped, and he refused to speak of where he'd gone. The man died in 2014, but his diary, discovered by a family member, contained a sketch of the same spiral symbol etched into the margin beside the entry dated July 12, 1983. The handwriting underneath read, "It doesn't want the trees to forget." Among folklorists, the idea that landscapes can absorb trauma is not new. Forests, in particular, are said to carry the echoes of what they witness, places where memory becomes ecological rather than emotional. In the case of Black Hollow, researchers have proposed that the land itself has been changed. Not cursed, not haunted, but altered at a level that science doesn't yet quantify. As though something was buried there, not physically, but perceptually. Not a body, not a crime, but a disturbance, a subtraction, a presence removed and yet not gone. Some believe the pines were witnesses. Others think they were accomplices. A few, more unsettlingly, propose that the forest was a mechanism, that what happened to the boys didn't happen inside the cabin, but within the canopy, beneath the bark, behind the hush between rustling leaves. That something old, patient, and endless lives in the stillness between the trunks. That it needed listeners. That it fed on forgetting. To this day, the forest has not reclaimed the ruins of Cabin 12. Ivy wraps the supports. Moss covers the beams. But the structure stands, roof sagging, doorframe tilted but intact. The pines do not grow through it. They lean away. They allow it to remain, as though even the forest knows it cannot bury what it remembers. Only hold it and wait. Cabin 12 was never demolished. Despite the official closure of Black Hollow Retreat, the cabin remains standing in the center of a decaying clearing, its silhouette visible through the skeletal arms of the surrounding trees. Of the 12 original cabins, it is the only one not overtaken by forest or rot. The others collapsed under snowdrifts or picked apart by time and scavengers. But Cabin 12 persists, its door still on its hinges, its walls still upright, its windows unbroken. No graffiti, no animal nests, no visible decay beyond the natural discoloration of age, as though time, too, has forgotten to touch it. Attempts to raise the structure have quietly failed. In 1998, a demolition team arrived to dismantle all remaining buildings on the camp property. Every structure was removed except Cabin 12. The crew's foreman later reported an equipment issue that prevented the backhoe from operating near the cabin. Multiple machines failed to start within a 50-foot radius. Tools disappeared. Workers refused to approach the structure after nightfall. The project was abandoned without formal explanation, and the cabin was left untouched. A surveyor who visited the site in 2003 documented structural anomalies. Using laser measuring tools, he noted that the cabin's interior dimensions were inconsistent with the exterior frame. The cabin measured 17 by 19 feet from the outside, yet the interior diagonal suggested dimensions several inches larger on all sides. He recalibrated the device multiple times, assuming error, but the data remained the same. He wrote in his report, "There is more space inside than there should be." He later withdrew the report and left the project. Those who enter the cabin often describe a disquieting absence, not of sound, but of presence. The air inside is colder than outside, even in summer. Shadows fall in the wrong direction. There's a sensation of being observed, though no wildlife ventures near. Compasses spin when placed on the floorboards. Digital watches stall. Batteries drain without warning. One visitor claimed her phone's voice memo app began recording on its own the moment she crossed the threshold. When played back, the only audio was a breath, and then her own voice saying a phrase she did not remember speaking. They never left. The beds remain. 4 bunks, each with nameplates still affixed above the headboard. The names are faded but legible. Thomas, Levi, Jordan, Miles. The 5th bunk, if there ever was one, has no name. The wood is smooth and unmarked, as though scrubbed clean. Beneath it, initials were once discovered carved into floor, but attempts to photograph or copy them have always failed. Film overexposes. Pens run dry. Pencil markings blur. The floorboards swell over time, slowly covering the letters. It's as if the cabin resists being known. In 2017, a researcher placed a field recorder inside the cabin overnight as part of a paranormal study. No unusual sounds were recorded until precisely 3:12 a.m. Then, a sequence of soft knocking began. 6 slow taps. A pause, then 4 more. The pattern repeated twice. Audio analysis showed the knocks originated from inside the room, though no one was present. The pattern resembled a form of coded signaling, but no known language matched it. The researcher left the project weeks later, citing anxiety and recurring dreams of a boy whispering under the floorboards. Reports from drone operators flying over the area describe glitches when passing above Cabin 12. Video freezes. GPS location skew. On one occasion, a drone camera recorded a brief image of the cabin with all 4 bunks visibly empty, but a 5th shadow on the wall, slightly smaller than the others, facing away from the window. The operator believed it to be a software artifact. The footage later corrupted. The spiral symbol has been found carved beneath the cabin's threshold. Worn smooth, faint but still present. Always the same, counterclockwise, incomplete at the center. When measured, the spiral fits perfectly within the cabin's floor plan, aligning with the positions of the bunks and the doorway. The center of the spiral, when plotted, falls just beneath the floorboards between the 2 rear beds. No one has ever stayed overnight in Cabin 12 without incident. Those who have tried report vivid hallucinations, lost time, and an overwhelming sense of nostalgia for things they cannot name. One man claimed to dream of songs that did not exist, sung in voices that sounded like children underwater. Another reported waking with ash under his nails, and a single word burned into the side of his sleeping bag. Stay. Law enforcement no longer visits the site. The area has been removed from active search and rescue zones due to equipment interference and navigation failures. The land is not marked as hazardous, but hikers are discouraged. There are no signs, no warnings, just a space on the map where the wood's thin and something older lingers. Cabin 12 still stands, empty but never silent, waiting but never abandoned. Some believe it is a wound in the world, unhealed and still bleeding softly beneath its walls. Others think it is a memory kept in wood and shadow, refusing to fade. And there are those who insist the boys never left at all. Not fully, not completely, just quietly. Thank you for staying with me through this haunting tale. If you're still awake, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment, and let me know if you felt the silence too. If you found this story compelling, unsettling, or strangely peaceful, please consider subscribing to MrDarxnight for more quiet journeys into the unknown. Until next time, keep your lights low, your thoughts still, and remember, some things disappear not into darkness, but into silence. Good night.